I'd like to start today by going back to 1786, when the Americans realized that the Articles of Confederation had to be substantially modified. The Articles gave the unicameral Congress virtually no power to regulate domestic affairs. They had no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, there was no executive branch, and there was no judicial branch. In fact, they were nearly bankrupt. And because of that, all these issues, it eventually leads them to drafting and ratifying our Constitution. And so, what initially happened was 12 representatives from 5 states met at Annapolis, Maryland in 1786, and that became known as the Annapolis Convention. Now, their goal was to address barriers that had limited trade and commerce between the states, as they tended to compete with one another rather than trade and work with one another. However, since none of states were represented to really make any progress, the biggest decision they made was to simply meet again the next year. And so they sent a report to Congress to call a meeting of the states to meet in Philadelphia to examine the areas broader than that of just trade and commerce. Meanwhile, one of the events that kind of truly epitomizes the weaknesses of the Articles was known as Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shay kind of led this contingent of discontented farmers in western Massachusetts. Now, these small farmers were angered by crushing debts and taxes, interests, and foreclosures on their farms. In fact, they had kind of gathered so much support that Shay kind of leads this little rebellion. They marched to the courthouse and close it down in an attempt to try to stop the foreclosures. But the significance of that kind of lies in the fact that the Articles of Confederation had no power to suppress this rebellion, as they didn't have any ways to tax or raise an army. And so luckily it fell to some local business leaders to kind of try to put this down, but it just kind of showed the ineptness of the government, and truly something needed to be done. Therefore, in 1787, in the State House in Philadelphia, at the same place where the Declaration of Independence was signed, 55 delegates from 12 states met for 4 months. Now, their first order of business was to elect George Washington as president of the convention. But then the second most important thing probably was that they had ordered complete secrecy, as they had been charged with revamping or revising the Articles of Confederation. But when they got there, they discussed the bigger idea of abolishing it and creating something brand new. And so early in the convention, James Madison on the left here was the chief architect of what becomes known as the Virginia Plan. Now, this plan was brought forth to the committee by Edmund Randolph, who was a fellow Virginian. And this plan was to kind of help, lay the groundwork and foundation for what would to become the legislative branch. And it kind of favored the larger states with the larger population because representation would be based upon the number of people residing within each state. However, being that the smaller states, kind of disagreed with this, the fellow on the right, William Patterson, brings forth what's called the New Jersey Plan. And that was to say that each state should have equal representation in the new legislature. And as you are probably aware of, we resolved that conflict by a proposal put forth by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, known as the Connecticut Compromise. And that kind of creates our legislative branch as we have it today, where the House of Representatives is based upon a state's population, and in the Senate, each state would have 2 senators representing them. And just like that example, the Constitutional Convention was really built upon series and series of compromises by all these men who were in attendance. And one of the issues that probably came closest to destroying the Constitutional Convention and keeping it from working was the issue of slavery and what to do with it. And obviously, as it plays out, and as you can see, that's where we come up with the 3/5 compromise, where each slave would count as 3/5 of a person when we think about population and talking about numbers of representatives from each state, thus favoring the South, creating a bigger population with more representation then because of the 3/5 compromise. And then also to try to put slavery kind of on a back burner for the time being, it was also decided that the discussion of outlawing the slave trade could not be discussed for a period of at least 10 years until 1807. So there were numerous compromises and obviously big decisions that had to be ironed out to make this Constitutional Convention work. And so it plays out that when we see men like George Washington, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, you've got Robert Morris, who was an important political figure of the Confederation era, who had talked about financials and a strong government. And then you had James Madison, who helped kind of lead the Constitutional Convention in forming this new government. And so once they all sign the Constitution, it has to be turned over to the states to decide upon and ratified. And so the real conflict and the trouble just kind of begins now, as they weren't going to just turn it over to the state assemblies. They'd probably shoot it down because they didn't want to lose their power. And so it was decided that special state constitutional conventions would be held to kind of ratify and debate the passing of the Constitution. And if we recall our civics lessons, so we would know that what they had passed at the convention here created national, state, and concurrent powers. There really was a separation of federal powers, as James Madison had believed that a large population, large government was good because it kind of controlled the factions. And the separation of powers kept any one person or group of people from becoming too powerful. And then also it talked about the electoral college, as that's kind of what cast the deciding ballots in presidential elections. But as you recall, these are things like from our civics lessons that were going to be debated and ratified by the 13 states. And it plays out where we have, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, and kind of where these Anti-Federalists were kind of had their strongholds. And what they believed was that, the voters were going to be too distant from their representatives, that they really wouldn't be able to hold them accountable. And it really turns out to be a close vote in the larger states especially. But what was decided was that for the Constitution to be ratified, it only needed to be passed by 9 of the states by these specially elected state conventions. And to help pacify some of the Anti-Federalists, who again were fearful of too strong of a central government and losing their states' rights and kind of getting a tyrannical government in place, there's a series of papers known as the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, which kind of put forth the arguments as to why a stronger federal government was needed. But in the end, what kind of helped, kind of convince some of the Anti-Federalists to go ahead and support and ratify the Constitution was kind of reassuring them that people's rights would be protected. In fact, what was promised was the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments was agreed upon to be passed and ratified once the Constitution was ratified, and these would include rights that would protect people's freedom of speech, press, assembly, religion, right to bear arms, trial by jury type issues, something to try to make sure that it was stated and clear what exactly were people's rights under the Constitution. And with that, the Constitution is ratified by the states, is enacted, and we'll take a look at further developments in our nation's history in our next episode.